The room hushed the moment the microphone touched my sister's lips. Crystal light fell over her like a stage cue, bright enough to pick up the edges of her smile and the cool glint in her eyes. A quartet tucked near the wall finished their last note bows, hanging in the air, and dinner knives paused mid-air above china. Somewhere behind me, a candle hissed as a drop of wax found its way to linen. I was at a distant table, hands folded, when Nicole lifted her glass and said, soft as silk and sharp as a needle, "We have a special guest tonight, my sister Abigail, though she doesn't belong with us anymore." A small laugh broke from a corner near the bar. Someone coughed to cover it. Across the room, my mother's hand tightened on my father's shoulder, a gesture that always meant, "Compose yourself." The air turned a shade colder, the way it does when a door opens onto winter. I held my glass, not high, not low, just steady, and forced my breath to land in the center of my chest. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, hit the like button and share this with someone who'll understand, then make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. But to understand how that single sentence split an evening in two, you need to know what brought me back to that table in the first place. My name is Abigail Clark. I make a living seeing the numbers behind the story and the story behind the numbers. I left Manhattan at 18 with a battered suitcase and a mind full of ledgers, and I learned early that an even voice cut straighter than a raised one. In Chicago, I built a life measured in late nights, smart bets, and a window that looks over the treetops of the park. I keep promises, and I keep receipts. What I've never been able to keep is my family's attention for longer than the length of a toast. Growing up in our house meant learning to read a room faster than you could read a book. My father believed in excellence you could count. My mother believed in beauty you could photograph. Nicole arrived like a ribbon cut on a new store flashbulbs, smiles people clapping before they knew what they were applauding for. When I brought home straight A's, Dad would nod, pleased, in a quiet way. When Nicole stepped onto a stage for 3 lines in a school play, the house filled with flowers and congratulations. I learned to be efficient in the space left over. That old choreography followed me into the restaurant that night like a shadow. I'd flown in with a gift wrapped in dark paper and tied with a narrow silver ribbon, something my father would recognize, without a single word, the twin of a watch he'd once told me about in a late, rare conversation at age 12. I wore a navy suit that would disappear into any boardroom, and a pair of diamond studs that never asked for attention. The hostess smiled with a kind of rehearsed warmth and led me toward the back to table 7 near the service corridor, where the clatter from the kitchen slipped through whenever the door swung open. From there, the room looked like a photograph of our family's values. The center table where my father sat gleamed beneath a chandelier heavy with flowers and men in expensive suits. My mother's gown matched the silver in her hair and the shine of the flatware. Nicole moved like she owned the light-touching elbows, letting her laugh land where it would fetch the most attention. When I rose during a quiet stretch between courses, gift in hand, she appeared beside me with the weightless grace of a dancer and said, smiling for the camera's gifts after dinner, Abigail, "We've arranged a lovely presentation." I nodded because that was the only polite answer left. My father's eyes flickered to the box, then back to Nicole's face, as if waiting for stage direction. I returned to table 7 and set the gift down like something warm I couldn't keep in my hands. The menu read like a love letter to the city handmade pasta veal with lemon and capers a Bordeaux older than I am. Conversation turned the room into a low, steady river. Beside me, Uncle Bobby slipped into the empty seat with the cautious ease of someone who knows where the floorboards creak. "Don't take it to heart," he said under the hum. "Nicole's been running the show a while." "How's the show doing?" I asked, eyes still on my father's table. He studied his wine like it might answer for him. Too many new curtains. Not enough stagehands. Then the server arrived with the main course, and the door to the kitchen breathed another wave of heat and garlic into the room. At the center table, my father lifted his glass to greet someone late, and I saw the lines around his mouth as clearly as I saw the stitches on the linen. He'd aged beyond the photographs on the hallway walls. Years, caught not in his hair, which was nearly white, but in the slope of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. I had come back to repair, not to pry, but even from table 7, you can feel when a foundation has shifted under a house. Dessert plates landed like porcelain moons. The quartet played something bright and forgettable. Then Nicole rose, and the first sound that disappeared was the clatter from the kitchen. Tonight, she began, we honor our father, whose vision built more than restaurants. He built rooms where families marked their milestones. She was good, and she knew it. Her voice softened, then brightened, then softened again, the way you tune a radio while you drive. When she introduced the formal recognition of our next chapter, a murmur swept the middle tables. She announced Dad's new title, Chairman Emeritus, and her own as CEO, a crown passed from one pair of polished hands to another. My father stood on cue and sat back down just as quickly, his expression proud. And for a breath, something else. Resignation looks different on every face. On his, it looked like someone smoothing a page he didn't choose. I felt the sting of what came next before the words arrived. She lifted her glass toward the back of the room. We also welcome a special guest, my sister Abigail. The spotlight searched and found me. I raised my glass a fraction and kept my face still, because sometimes that's the only way to keep your dignity from slipping. She's been very busy, Nicole went on, smiling toward the investors, which is why family gatherings haven't fit her calendar in years. A practiced laugh rippled around us, little and mean. Then she did what people do when they want to close a door without touching it. She pointed. And for those asking about the future of our family business, let me be clear. It will stay with those who have remained loyal. Some people don't belong with us anymore. My mother's eyes dropped to the table. Jason shifted in his seat, then recovered into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. At the far wall, the manager Thomas froze with a leather folder tucked under his arm, like even the building had been told to stand still. I took a slow breath and tasted the tannins of the Bordeaux. The room fell a shade quieter, that particular silence that comes when people expect a reaction and prepare to enjoy it. There is a skill to not giving them what they came for. It takes practice and a spine, like tempered steel. I set my napkin on the table and stood. Chairs scraped lightly. Nicole's smile held, as if it had been painted on and needed time to dry. I walked to the gift table and picked up the small box with the silver ribbon, then crossed to my father. Up close, he looked older and more human than the legend on the walls. I felt 12 again, recalling an evening at our kitchen table when he'd told me about his father's watch and how losing it during lean years had felt like swallowing a stone. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, keeping my voice for him alone. He hesitated, always that tiny pause, and then opened the lid. The face caught the light and held it. The first real thing in the room that had nothing to do with performance was the look in his eyes. "Where did you find?" he began. "Same model. Same year," I said gently. "So you can look down at something that tells the truth. The moment should have rested there, a small harbor in a storm." But Nicole stepped into it, voice honeyed for the guests and sharpened for me. "How touching," she said. "Some of us gave our lives to this business. Others bring party favors." Laughter again, thinner now. Thomas, still holding the folder, approached her elbow. "Miss Clark," he said, quiet enough to be polite, loud enough to be heard. "As requested, the final bill." She took it without looking, still smiling for the room. "Thank you, Thomas. Add it to the monthly accounts." Thomas didn't move. Per your instruction, this event was to be billed separately. She opened the folder and the color left her face. A few guests craned, curious but pretending not to be. My father shifted in his chair, eyes darting from the watch to the page in Nicole's hands. I felt every eye in the room slide toward me like a tide turning. Not because I'd asked for it, because that's what a spectacle does. It chooses its next target. I could have swallowed the moment, let it disappear into the clink of glassware and the hum of conversation resuming. I could have sat back down at table 7 and made myself smaller the way you learn to do in a house where the light is spoken for. Instead, I placed my palm lightly on the table beside my father, as if steadying myself on a railing, and met Nicole's eyes. I said nothing. Sometimes silence is the clearest instrument. She lifted her chin, found her smile again, and raised her glass. To loyalty, she said. To those who belong. Glasses rose like a field of mirrors. A few clinked with enthusiasm. A few hesitated mid-air. My mother's glass trembled just enough to stir the surface of the wine. I lowered my gaze to the watch face in my father's hand. The second hand moved with unbothered precision, cutting circles independent of applause or disapproval. I thought about time, the hours I'd spent in libraries, the years I'd spent away, the minutes it takes to erase a person in public. Then I looked past the chandeliers to the front doors of the room, and they seemed farther away than they had when I first sat down. The quartet began again, a cue to return the evening to its script. Staff moved with expert calm. The kitchen door swung open and closed, glimpses of white jackets and heat and metal. The life of the place continued under the paper theater we'd built on top of it. I returned the gift box lid to its place, set it softly on the table, and stepped back. The distance between the center of the room and table 7 felt longer on the way back, like the carpet had lengthened to teach me a lesson. I sat, folded my napkin again, and let my hands rest where I could see them. Inside my chest, something I couldn't name shifted. Not a snap or a break, more like the slow release of a knot you've carried so long, you forget it isn't part of you. I looked at my father, then at Nicole, then at the doors again, measuring the space I had in which to breathe. When the glasses came down, and the music swelled, and the conversations resumed, I understood 2 things in the same breath. First, the decision to cut me out had been made long before the toast. Tonight was only the ribbon cutting. Second, whatever came next would not be decided at table 7. The candles burned lower. The watch on my father's wrist found its rhythm. And I felt the first cold edge of solitude press against my ribs, the kind that follows you out into the night and keeps pace with your footsteps, waiting for what you'll do when no one is clapping. Uncle Bobby stayed seated after dessert, his glass untouched, his eyes following the tension that now rippled through the room. From table 7, the laughter at the center sounded different, thinner, brittle around the edges. When the quartet began another piece, I realized my hands were still trembling under the napkin. My mother's smile had returned to its polished default. My father leaned toward one of his investors, speaking in short sentences. Nicole floated, as always, perfectly in control. Yet beneath the clinking of glasses, there was the faint hum of something uneasy whispers that didn't fit the tone of celebration. When I finally stood to stretch, Uncle Bobby looked up. "Don't go far," he murmured. "You might want to hear what comes next." His voice carried the weight of warning more than curiosity. I took a slow breath, excused myself from the table, and moved toward the back of the room where a narrow hallway led to the restrooms and service corridor. The air was cooler there, scented faintly of lemon polish and roses from the centerpieces. It was the first quiet space I'd found all evening. I stayed only a minute before returning, long enough to catch my reflection in a gilt mirror. My face was composed, but my eyes betrayed the effort. I had come here hoping for connection. What I found instead was a stage play that didn't have a place for me in the cast. When I came back into the dining room, Nicole had taken the microphone again. The sound of her voice drew me in before the meaning of her words did. She was standing beside our father, her arm linked through his, a portrait of loyalty that looked almost rehearsed. "Before we open the gifts," she said, "Dad has a special announcement to share. But first, a toast to the people who have stood by him through every challenge, those who believe in family hard work and unity." She let her gaze sweep the room, letting each pause stretch long enough for eyes to follow. Then she found me in the back and smiled, soft and satisfied. "And to those who chose another path, we wish them well." Applause rose like the tide. I stood still, feeling it crash around me. Then my father took the microphone. His voice, lower now, carried the wear of years spent commanding attention. "It's time," he said, "to pass the torch. I built this company with passion, but the future belongs to new energy." His eyes settled on Nicole and the applause swelled again. "Nicole will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer effective immediately. I'll step back to serve as advisor." I clapped because everyone else did. But in that moment, the room no longer felt warm. It felt airless. Nicole raised her glass once more, her tone lighter, but the edge in it sharp enough to draw blood. And in keeping with that future, she continued, "Our family structure has been updated to reflect loyalty and contribution. The Clark legacy remains with those who have dedicated their lives to it." Her hand lifted toward me as she said it. "Some of us no longer belong." The pause afterward was deliberate. A few guests laughed, uncertain whether it was safe to do so. Others looked down into their wine glasses. I saw my mother's knuckles whiten around the stem of hers. I didn't move. I didn't speak. But something inside me drew a line. It wasn't anger exactly, more the cold understanding that the distance between us had finally been spoken aloud. When the manager approached Nicole with a small leather folder, I saw confusion cross her face. It was the only honest expression she'd worn all night. She opened it, frowned, then whispered something to the waiter. A murmur traveled through the tables again, that collective awareness that something private had become public. I watched as my father leaned in to look, his expression darkening. My mother's head turned sharply toward Nicole. Whatever glamour the evening had held evaporated in that instant, replaced by the unmistakable scent of panic disguised as poise. I stayed seated quiet until the noise became unbearable. My own voice surprised me. When I stood, it sounded steady, detached, as if belonging to someone else. "Dad," I said, walking to his table before this celebration goes any further, "I'd like to give you your gift." Every eye followed as I placed the small box before him. The candles reflected off the paper. He hesitated, then opened it. The recognition in his eyes was swift and soft, a rare, unguarded moment that made him look years younger. "My father's watch," he murmured. "I haven't seen one like this in decades." I nodded. "You told me about it once when I was a kid. I thought you might want the story to come full circle." For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Even Nicole seemed uncertain. But she recovered fast. "A sentimental piece," she said, loud enough for the nearby tables. "Though some of us show our devotion through more than trinkets." Her tone had that bright falseness that made polite people laugh again. They did, but it sounded forced. That was when Thomas, the manager, spoke in a voice meant to be discreet, yet clear enough for the room. "Ms. Clark, the total for tonight's event is just over 10,000. Shall we charge the company or your account?" Nicole's smile froze. "Charge the company, of course." "I'm afraid," Thomas said, eyes flicking toward my father. "The instruction on file was that this be billed separately." The silence was a living thing. I could hear forks settling on plates, someone clearing their throat. My father's eyes narrowed. "Nicole," he said, "what is this?" "It's nothing," she insisted, flipping through the bill. "A clerical error." But it wasn't nothing. I knew it the way a banker knows a falsified ledger. The tremor in her voice, the flush along her neck, it all pointed in one direction. Something beneath the surface was coming apart. I could have stayed silent. I could have walked away. Instead, I reached into my clutch and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "It might be more than that," I said quietly, but the quiet carried. My father turned toward me. Nicole's eyes went cold. "Before coming tonight," I continued, "I reviewed the company's public filings. 3 locations are behind on vendor payments, and revenues are down nearly 30% this quarter. Expansion loans are past due." Gasps rose like a wave. My father stood abruptly. "Abigail." "Please," I said softly, "let me finish." I set the paper on the table, the numbers stark in black and white. "You've built something extraordinary, Dad. But it's bleeding, and she's been hiding it." Nicole's hand slammed against the table, rattling the glassware. "You came here to humiliate me. I came here to celebrate you," I replied, meeting her gaze. "You chose humiliation, all on your own." My mother whispered my name like a warning, but the damage was already done. The investors, the friends, the extended family, every face reflected some mix of shock and calculation. It was no longer a dinner party. It was exposure. I stepped back, letting the truth sit where it landed. My pulse roared in my ears. Nicole tried to regain control, speaking rapidly about temporary cash flow issues and pending investors. But the men from my father's study earlier looked grim. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, stood and said plainly, "You misrepresented the company's stability." Her voice wavered. "That's not true," another man interrupted. "We'll be reviewing our involvement first thing Monday." My father looked at her then, not with anger, but with something worse, recognition. The kind of look that says he's seen a ghost and finally believes it's real. I turned away from the table, my breath shallow. Behind me, the orchestra had stopped playing. I heard the whisper of heels against tile as guests began leaving in clusters, murmuring about schedules, about early mornings, about anything except the spectacle they had just witnessed. By the time I reached the restaurant doors, the night air felt almost kind, cool, steady, honest. I wrapped my coat tighter and stepped outside. The city hummed, traffic lights glinting off wet pavement. I walked slowly, the echo of my heels blending with the faint rhythm of rain beginning to fall. Halfway down the block, I heard my father's voice behind me. "Abigail, wait." He caught up breath, unsteady. Under the streetlight, his face looked smaller somehow, the authority of the evening stripped away. "Is it true?" he asked. "Everything you said?" I nodded once. "It's all in the filings. You can check for yourself." He exhaled a long, weary sound. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the banks will start calling soon." Nicole's expansions she borrowed against assets she couldn't replace. He pressed a hand to his temple as though trying to steady the world around him. "Why tell me like that, in front of everyone?" I looked up at the building, its facade glowing soft gold against the dark sky. "Because that's where she chose to shame me. I only returned the truth to its proper owner." He fell silent. The rain gathered strength, scattering droplets across the street like silver dust. "I never wanted this," he said finally. "Not between my daughters. You did, though." I answered not unkindly. "You just didn't see the cost." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he reached out, touching my arm lightly. "Please don't disappear again. We'll talk tomorrow. I'll need your help." I didn't promise. I simply met his eyes, then turned toward the avenue where a line of cabs waited. The door shut behind me with the soft click of inevitability. That night in my hotel room overlooking the park, I didn't sleep. My phone buzzed until I silenced it. Messages from my mother, a few from Jason, and one from Nicole unread, but already felt a storm waiting in the inbox. I stood by the window, watching the lights blink across the city. Somewhere below, my family's restaurants glowed in warm tones, filled with people who had no idea what storm was brewing behind those polished doors. I thought about my father's face, about the fear behind his questions, and the faint trace of regret when he said he needed me. I thought about the years I'd spent building walls, and the strange pull that still drew me toward the house I'd left behind. When dawn came pale and slow, I made coffee in the small silver pot by the sink. The air smelled faintly of rain and paper. I opened my laptop and pulled up every document I could find on Clark Restaurant Group. Numbers filled the screen rows and columns of truth. I stared at them until they blurred, until the exhaustion behind my eyes gave way to something else entirely resolve. I didn't know yet whether I would help them or how. But one thing was certain. Whatever came next would not be played out under chandeliers or applause. It would happen in daylight with fax signatures and choices that carried real cost. And somewhere beneath all that calculation, I felt the first ache of loneliness settling in a quiet reminder that truth once spoken doesn't hand you comfort. It hands you space. Empty at first, then waiting. By mid-morning, the phone calls had stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy but necessary. I sat by the window of my hotel room, watching rain drift down the glass in slow, uncertain streaks. Below, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Taxis honking umbrellas tilting against the wind. Strangers walking with purpose. The night before still echoed through my thoughts, the toast, the watch my father's face when the truth landed. I had expected anger. What lingered instead was exhaustion, a kind of quiet collapse that felt worse than rage. When the phone rang again, I almost didn't answer. But the voice on the other end carried a steadiness I hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm not calling to pressure you," Uncle Bobby said. "Just to give you context." I exhaled. I think context is all I've got left right now. He told me about the morning's aftermath, the investors who had pulled their funding, the restaurant managers who were worried about paychecks, and the staff caught in the crossfire. 30 people were laid off today, he said quietly. Good people. They deserve better than this mess. I pressed my thumb against the window pane, tracing the path of a raindrop. They do, I murmured. There's something else you should know, he added. Your father tried to reach you, years ago after your promotion made the papers. Nicole intercepted his letters. The words landed like small stones. Letters, dozens, he said. She kept them in her desk, said she was protecting him from rejection. I only found them last year. I closed my eyes, the image of those folded envelopes piling up in silence forming in my mind. So he thought I ignored him, I said. Yes, and you thought he stopped caring. That's how she kept you apart. The line went quiet for a moment. I could hear him shifting papers, his breath unsteady. Whatever you decide to do now, he said, just remember that this isn't only about them. There are livelihoods at stake. You've always had the clearer head, Abby. Maybe you can still save what matters. After we hung up, I stared at the skyline until it blurred into gray. Part of me wanted to board the first plane back to Chicago and leave the wreckage behind. But the image of my father's trembling hand on that watch, the one I'd chosen to symbolize permanence, stayed with me. By afternoon, I called my assistant Claire to ask for a file. pull everything we have on restaurant turnarounds, I said. Debt restructuring, bridge, financing, the whole scope. She didn't ask questions, only said, "You'll have it within the hour." I spent the next few hours buried in numbers. Profit margins, loan schedules, projected cash flow facts without emotion, the only language I trusted. When I finally looked up, the room had grown dim and my coffee had gone cold. The facts told a story no one had wanted to read. Clark Restaurant Group was on the verge of collapse. The Chicago expansion had drained resources beyond repair, and new investors had been promised returns that didn't exist. At sunset, I called my father directly. His voice on the line sounded older, thinner. "Abigail." "I've gone through the financials," I said. "You need an emergency meeting. Board investors, everyone. Tomorrow morning." He hesitated. "You'll come. I'll present options," I said carefully. "What happens next depends on a few conditions." The meeting was set for 9. That night, sleep never came. I sat at the small desk by the window, papers spread like a storm around me. Every decision I'd ever made to work harder to build a loan to leave felt like preparation for this moment. By dawn, I had built a plan. Ruthless, logical, and if they would accept it, salvageable. When I arrived at the corporate offices the next morning, the air inside felt stale, as if it too had been waiting for someone to open a window. My father greeted me with a weary nod. Nicole sat opposite him, red-eyed but defiant. Jason stood behind her hands clasped, looking more like an observer than an ally. The boardroom filled slowly, 3 board members, 2 investors, Uncle Bobby and the company's CFO. A quiet man named Alan Green, whom I'd only met once years ago. He looked relieved to see me, which told me everything I needed to know. I began without ceremony. Clark Restaurant Group. I said, sliding copies of my report across the table, is insolvent. Cash flow cannot meet obligations beyond 60 days. But there's still value here. Brand equity, real estate, and loyal employees who know how to run these kitchens. If drastic action is taken immediately, there's a path forward. The investors leaned in, scanning the pages. My father's hand shook slightly as he turned each sheet. I outlined the plan carefully, closing 3 underperforming locations, halting all new construction, renegotiating vendor contracts, reinstating veteran managers who had been dismissed under Nicole's tenure, and securing bridge financing through my firm's contacts. Nicole interrupted halfway through. "So your solution is to dismantle everything I built." "My solution," I said evenly, "is to save what's left before there's nothing to dismantle." Her chair scraped against the tile as she stood. "You want control. That's all this is." I met her glare calmly. "Control is the only way this survives. The banks won't lend without qualified oversight." One of the investors, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, cleared her throat. "And what role do you propose for yourself, Ms. Clark?" "I'll invest several million in working capital," I replied, in exchange for a 25% equity stake and full authority as chief financial officer until the company is stable. Nicole remains as COO, focused on branding and customer experience. My father rubbed his temples. "You're buying into your own family's company?" "I'm buying a chance to save it," I said softly. "If no one steps in, bankruptcy will decide for you." The room fell into an uneasy hush. Nicole's voice broke it. "This is extortion. It's business," I answered. "Nothing more." Uncle Bobby leaned forward, folding his hands. "She's right, Nicole. Without cash and experienced management, this is over." Nicole looked to our father for rescue, but for once he didn't meet her eyes. He looked at me instead. "Everyone, give us a few minutes," he said quietly. "I need to speak with my daughters alone." When the others left, the silence that settled felt heavier than before. My father turned to Nicole first. "Did you really keep those letters from me?" Her mouth parted, but no words came. Finally, she whispered, "I was protecting you." She didn't want to be part of this family. That wasn't your decision to make. He said, his voice rough. You made it impossible for us to even try. Then he turned to me. And you built a life and never looked back. Not when I got sick, not when we needed you. You sent flowers, Abigail. Flowers instead of a call. I swallowed hard. You're right. He nodded, weary. We've both been wrong. Maybe this is the only way to make something right again. When the others returned, he announced the decision himself. We'll move forward with Abigail's plan, he said. Nicole will continue as COO. Abigail will assume financial authority. Nicole's face went pale. You're choosing her over me. I'm choosing the company, he said firmly. For a moment, I thought she might walk out. Instead, she sank back into her chair, lips pressed together, fury flickering beneath the surface. The investors nodded, the board murmured agreement, and just like that, the course was set. I should have felt relief, but what I felt instead was an ache somewhere deeper than pride. When the meeting ended, my father stayed seated, the papers spread before him. If you're coming back, he said quietly. No more running. Be here, fully. I met his gaze. That seems fair. As the others began to leave, Nicole lingered by the doorway. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. You have your own life. You don't need us. I considered her for a moment. Because it's still my name on the sign, and because some things are worth fixing, even when they shouldn't have to be. She didn't answer. She only looked down at her hands and left without another word. When I stepped outside into the late afternoon light, the air felt clearer than it had in days. The storm had passed, but the sky was still unsettled, streaked with lingering gray. Across the street, a young couple laughed over coffee, unaware of the wars that happen quietly inside families. I walked slowly, my shoes clicking against the pavement. The world, it seemed, kept turning, no matter what truths had been dragged into daylight. For the first time in years, I wasn't sure whether I was walking toward home or away from it. But somewhere between those two directions, a kind of balance began to take shape. The past was still there, bruised and unfinished, but so was the possibility of something new. And as I reached the corner, the evening breeze caught the hem of my coat, carrying with it the faintest scent of roasted garlic and wine from a nearby restaurant, reminding me that even in the ashes of failure, life still waited to be rebuilt. The following morning began with the quiet hum of preparation. The office lights flickered on before sunrise, washing the boardroom in pale gold as I laid out new documents, balance sheets, lease revisions, bridge loan drafts. Outside, the streets were still damp from the night's rain. Inside, every inch of air felt charged with expectation. I wasn't nervous anymore. What replaced it was a kind of calm determination, the same feeling I used to get before presenting to clients who didn't believe a young woman could read a market better than they could. This time, though, it wasn't about numbers on a screen. It was about something that carried my name. My father arrived first, coat draped over his arm, the lines in his face deeper, but less defeated than they had been. You've been here all night, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the room. Almost, I replied. There's work to do. Nicole entered a few minutes later, followed by Jason. She looked drawn, but composed, her clipboard pressed against her chest like armor. Behind her came the board members and two investors, faces still wary but less hostile than before. Once everyone had taken their seats, I began. Clark Restaurant Group, I said, has a future if we stop pretending it's invincible. No one interrupted. The projection screen behind me glowed with figures and timelines, maps of closures and reopenings, a route back to solvency. My voice stayed even as I explained which locations had to close, which ones could be saved, and how long it would take to reach stability. I proposed rehiring veteran managers, reducing vendor contracts, and halting the Chicago construction immediately. Every word felt like a stitch in a wound that had been open too long. When I finished, the silence was heavy but not hostile. Nicole broke it. "So you expect us to admit failure?" she said, her tone brittle. "I expect us to survive," I answered. "There's a difference." An investor leaned forward. "What would your role be in this plan?" It was the question I had known would come. I took a slow breath. "Chief Financial Officer. Full authority over all financial decisions until the company is profitable again. In return, I'll invest my own funds enough to stabilize operations for the next year." Nicole's voice cracked through the quiet like glass breaking. "That's a power grab." "No," I said softly. "It's a safeguard." Her chair scraped back. "You'd take a quarter of the company just to rescue it from problems you exposed in the first place." "How convenient." My father lifted his hand. "Enough," he said, not unkindly. "You both care about this family, even if it looks different on the surface." He looked around the table. "Give us the room." The others filed out in silence until only the three of us remained. My father turned toward Nicole, his voice low but steady. "Did you intercept the letters I wrote to your sister?" Her expression faltered. "Who told you that? I asked if you did," he said. She stared at the polished table for a long moment. "I was protecting you," she said finally. "You thought she wanted nothing to do with us. I didn't want to see you humiliated again." His shoulders sank. "That wasn't your decision." When he looked at me, I saw both apology and disappointment in his eyes. "And you," he said. "You walked away and never looked back. You didn't call. Not once." I nodded slowly. I was tired of trying to be seen. He ran a hand through his hair. "Maybe I made it too easy for both of you to stop trying." For a long while, none of us spoke. Then he sighed, the sound rough and final. "We'll accept the plan," he said. "All of it." Nicole looked stricken. "Dad." "This isn't punishment," he said. "It's a lifeline. We'll do it her way." I felt the air shift, relief mixed with sorrow. No one was triumphant, only quieter. The board returned, the agreement was signed, and the first steps were set in motion. By evening, my father's office was scattered with papers again, but for the first time, they represented possibility rather than denial. As I gathered my notes, Nicole lingered near the doorway. Her voice came softer than I'd ever heard it. "Why risk it?" she asked. "You could walk away and let it fall." "Because it's still ours," I said, "and because sometimes saving something broken is the only way to understand what broke it." For weeks after that day, the company became my entire world. I worked with Alan, the CFO, late into the night, reviewing payroll, rewriting contracts, sending updates to creditors. I returned calls that had gone unanswered for months, speaking to vendors who had lost faith in the Clark name. Some nights, I caught my reflection in the office glass and saw my father's focus staring back. I wondered when that had happened. Nicole kept her title as COO but stayed mostly on the creative side, marketing menus, guest experience. We avoided each other more than we spoke. When we did, our conversations were clipped but professional. There were moments, though brief, almost human, when we shared quiet victories, a positive review, a vendor returning a day without bad news. My mother remained a distant presence, calling occasionally to check on my father's health, but never mentioning the tension between her daughters. It was her way of pretending peace until it arrived. By late winter, progress began to show. The debt curve started flattening. Vendors extended credit again. The Chicago project was frozen, but not abandoned, waiting for a better season. Still, the process wasn't gentle. There were layoffs, angry emails, tears from managers who had built their lives around our restaurants. I carried their disappointment home each night, like extra weight in my bag. One evening, long after the staff had gone, my father stopped by my office. He was holding 2 cups of coffee from the downstairs cafe. "You haven't eaten," he said simply, setting one in front of me. I smiled faintly. "Neither have you." He looked out the window at the city below, light stretching in every direction. "You've changed this place," he said. "You've changed me too, whether you meant to or not." I didn't answer. Some things are better left in the space between words. After he left, I stayed a while longer, the city lights flickering across the paperwork. It struck me then how strange it felt to belong somewhere again. Not entirely, not comfortably, but enough. Spring arrived quietly, bringing longer days and the faint smell of fresh herbs drifting in from the test kitchen. One afternoon, Nicole knocked on my door. She looked tired, but not hostile. "I've been reviewing the customer surveys," she said. "People love the changes, the smaller menu, the service, even the decor tweaks." "You were right about simplifying." "You were right about the new branding," I replied. "It brought people back." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "We make a good team when we're not trying to destroy each other." Her words hung there halfway between truth and apology. I nodded. Maybe it just took us too long to figure that out. That night, I walked through the main dining room of our flagship restaurant after closing. The air still held traces of garlic wine and candle smoke. The staff had gone, leaving behind neatly folded napkins and a faint warmth from the ovens. For the first time since I was a child, I could feel the heart of the place, not the business, but the legacy. It was imperfect and scarred, yet alive. When I reached the framed photograph near the entrance, the one of my father and grandfather on opening day, I stopped. Their faces were younger, their hope unbroken. I traced the edge of the frame with my finger and whispered, "We're still here." The next morning, I sent a memo to the board announcing a 6-month review celebration, a small gathering for investors, staff, and family to mark the turnaround. It wasn't about profit yet. It was about survival. The planning fell naturally between Nicole and me. We disagreed over floral arrangements, agreed on the menu, and worked side by side in a rhythm that no longer felt forced. There were no apologies, no speeches about forgiveness, just the quiet language of effort shared. On the evening of the event, I arrived early to check the setup. The restaurant gleamed new tables, polished glass, soft amber lighting. Nicole moved through the space with a clipboard giving instructions to staff, and when she caught my eye, she nodded. For a moment, I watched her as if seeing her for the first time, not as my rival, but as a woman who had tried too hard to be perfect and had nearly lost everything because of it. Guests began to arrive. My father greeted them at the door, his energy lighter, his laugh returning in small bursts. Even my mother seemed at ease, her expression softening as she watched her family move through the room without hostility. As the evening unfolded, conversations turned to optimism, plans for expansion, new hires, the future. The noise rose gently, blending with the music from the small quartet in the corner. Toward the end of the night, my father lifted his glass for a toast. His words were simple but carried the weight of years. "We've been tested," he said, "but sometimes the storm that nearly sinks the ship is what teaches you how to steer." He motioned for Nicole and me to stand beside him. "To my daughters," he said, voice thick with emotion, "to learning how to rebuild together." Applause filled the room. I glanced at Nicole, who smiled, genuine this time. Something inside me settled quiet and full. When the guests began to leave, I lingered by the bar, watching the staff laugh as they cleared the tables. My father joined me holding the watch I'd given him months earlier. He turned it in his hands, the gold catching the light. "Time really does fix things," he said softly. "Not on its own," I replied. "Only when people do the work." He nodded, slipping the watch back onto his wrist. "Then, let's keep doing it." The lights dimmed to their evening glow, and for a moment, the three of us, father, daughter, daughter, stood in quiet agreement. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon. The clatter of dishes faded into laughter. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, their reflections stretching across the windows. I watched them and thought about how repair never happens all at once. It happens like this slowly, quietly, until one day you look around and realize the light has changed. The restaurant slept in half-light tables, cleared the last clink of glassware, echoing faintly from the kitchen. The celebration had ended hours ago, but I stayed behind, listening to the silence breathe through the space. Outside, soft rain traced lines down the tall windows, washing away the smudges of the day. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like rest. I stood by the entryway, watching the glow from the street lamps spill across the wood floors. The sign above the door, Clark & Clark, reflected faintly in the glass. The name still felt strange on my tongue, shared now, no longer claimed. Maybe that was what made it feel right. Nicole's laughter floated from the back office, gentler, now lighter. She was saying goodnight to the kitchen staff, thanking them one by one. It wasn't the kind of charm she used to perform for investors or guests. It was unpolished, real. I caught a glimpse of her as she turned off the last light hair pulled back, sleeves rolled, clipboard tucked under her arm. For the first time, she looked like part of the work, not above it. When she noticed me still standing there, she hesitated. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," I said. "Too much noise still running in my head." She smiled faintly, closing the office door behind her. "Dad's already home. He said he hasn't seen you look this peaceful since college." "That's because he didn't look closely back then," I said, and she laughed just once, soft and honest. We stood there for a while, the two of us listening to the rain tap against the awning. No speeches, no apologies. Just two people who had finally stopped fighting the same war from opposite sides. When she turned to leave, she paused by the door. "I'll be here early tomorrow," she said. "The new suppliers are coming in." "I'll be here too," I replied. Her eyes lingered on me for a beat. "I know." After she left, I walked back through the restaurant one last time. The scent of rosemary and wine still hung in the air. I stopped by the framed photo of my father and grandfather again. The same one I'd touched months ago. Tonight, it looked different. Maybe because for the first time, the story behind it wasn't stuck in grief or guilt. It was still being written. When I finally stepped outside, the rain had turned to a drizzle. The city felt washed clean. I walked to the corner and looked back once more at the glowing sign. In the reflection, my face appeared beneath it. Not the daughter left out of photographs. Not the outsider at table 7, but someone who belonged exactly where she was standing. The next few months passed in quiet rhythm. The restaurants settled into steady operation. The new team ran like clockwork, with Alan keeping the books balanced and my father offering mentorship instead of orders. Nicole found her footing in areas that matched her strengths: public relations, event coordination, community partnerships. She stopped trying to impress and started trying to understand. The change didn't happen all at once, but it stayed. My mother began to visit more often. At first, she came under the pretense of checking on your father, but she stayed longer each time, asking about menu changes, tasting new dishes, complimenting the staff. She still noticed every detail, still smoothed every wrinkle, but her voice carried less judgment, now more care. Once as she left, she reached out and adjusted the collar of my jacket, a small gesture that spoke louder than any apology could have. By summer, the Chicago project was back in motion, cautious, transparent this time, with investors who understood the full story. The mistakes weren't erased, but they'd become part of the architecture, like cracks repaired with gold, visible but strengthened. One afternoon, my father called me into his office. Sunlight fell across his desk, glinting off the watch on his wrist. He was turning it absently as he spoke. "Do you ever think about how long it took for us to get here?" he asked. "Every day," I said. He smiled, weary but content. "I thought legacy meant holding on. Turns out, it means letting go of control, letting you two do it better." I leaned against the doorframe. "You taught us more than you think. Maybe not the easy lessons, but the kind that last." He nodded. "You both made me proud in ways I didn't expect." That's the good kind of surprise. That evening, when I walked out into the late light, I saw Nicole standing by the curb, waving to a delivery truck. She looked tired, hair undone, clipboard under her arm. I walked over and helped her close the truck's back latch. "Looks like we survived another week," she said, half laughing. "Barely," I replied, and she smiled in that quiet, almost sisterly way we were both still learning. We watched the truck disappear down the street before she said, "You know, I found something in one of my old drawers. One of the letters I never mailed to you. From Dad. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away." "What did it say?" I asked. She looked down at her shoes. "He wrote that he was proud of you, but didn't know how to tell you without sounding weak." I didn't answer right away. The air smelled like rain on asphalt, sharp and clean. "Then you should keep it," I said. "Maybe now you understand it better than he ever did." Nicole nodded, and for once she didn't try to fill the silence. That weekend, we held a small luncheon for the staff, no press, no investors, just our people. My father made his famous lasagna, something he hadn't cooked himself in years. The kitchen filled with the smell of tomatoes and basil, the sound of laughter, and the rhythm of knives on cutting boards. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never actually lived. After lunch, my father poured us each a glass of wine. He raised his to me, then to Nicole. "You two taught me something I should have known a long time ago," he said. "Family isn't about control. It's about trust." Nicole blinked quickly and looked down at her glass. I reached out and touched his hand. "We're learning too, Dad." Later, as I walked alone through Central Park, the evening sun filtering through leaves, I thought about how different everything felt now. Not perfect, never perfect, but real. The kind of peace that doesn't need applause. The kind that arrives quietly and stays because you've earned it. I still live in Chicago most of the year, but I visit New York often now. The company runs smoothly without my constant presence, which is exactly how it should be. Nicole and I talk more than we used to sometimes about work, sometimes just about life. My mother sends photos from her garden. My father calls to ask about my next trip before I can remind him I've already sent the itinerary. Little things, ordinary, steady things. Sometimes when I walk into the flagship restaurant unannounced, the hostess greets me with a smile and says, "Welcome back, Miss Clark." And it still catches me off guard how good that feels to be welcomed not as the prodigal or the outsider, but as part of something whole. One evening in early autumn, I stopped by after closing. The air outside carried that first hint of chill. Inside, the lights glowed low and warm. My father's watch ticked softly on my wrist. I'd borrowed it that day for a meeting, and it felt fitting to end the night with it still on. I set it down on the counter beside a folded napkin, and a single stem of rosemary someone had left behind. The smell of it, earthy alive, filled the air. I thought of everything we'd lost and everything we'd managed to rebuild. Peace doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask to be noticed. It comes quietly when you finally stop trying to prove you deserve it. Before I left, I turned out the lights and stood in the doorway for one last look. The reflection of the sign shimmered in the glass. Clark and Clark, a legacy shared, imperfect but enduring. If this story touched you, tell me where you're listening from. Maybe you've faced your own kind of rebuilding, the kind that takes time and grace. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, second chances, and the families we choose to mend.